In the heart of the Grey Mountains lies one of the most famous Dwarven fortresses.
No one knows the origins of Karak Hvit. The oldest rune masters say it was founded before the War of the Beard, when the dwarves were still in good terms with the elves. The collaboration between these two complementary races could explain the beauty of its dazzling white ramparts. Built on mountainside and protected by the river Rogna, this stronghold was renowned for being one of the safest in the east of the Old World. Our story begins a quiet summer morning. The hills surrounding the ramparts were peaceful. Inside, the great hall was empty and silent. Only a few vigilant lookouts at the top of the ramparts attested to the dwarf presence inside the mountain. At 7 a.m., a company of miners returned from an expedition with its cargo of gold and precious metals. They were greeted by Vitar, lord of the place and descendant of a long line of illustrious chiefs. The reunion was joyful because the expedition had been a great success. The prosperity of the colony was assured for the years to come. Suddenly, while the miners were still busy unloading their cargo, the sound of the alarm echoed in the hall. An army was approaching. Soon, endless columns of orcs and goblins were seen marching by, accompanied by primitive war machines and monstrous trolls. Warlord Fenric was at the gates of Karak Hvit. To provoke the dwarves, he had brought a prisoner, a dwarf slayer tied from head to toe and who seemed to be in bad shape. As soon as the threat was identified, the garrison set to work, preparing the defense of the fortress. That morning, the floor of the Great Hall was pounded with the hammering of dwarf boots as powerful war machines were driven to the top of the ramparts. Every dwarf knew his place and his role. The fortress was ready to counter the horde. Goblin assault would come crashing down on its walls like the sea on rocks. In a first pathetic attempt to gain access to the city, the goblin launched a swarm of fanatics to break the fortress gate. Most of the goblins, drugged with hallucinogenic mushrooms, perished under the precious fire of the dwarf arquebusiers stationed on the walls. The few remaining fanatics smashed through the gates without inflicting any serious damage. When this failed, Fenring sent a huge troll that advanced alone toward the great gate. Despite numerous wounds, the beast's supernatural regenerative abilities allowed it to survive the barrage of cannon and arquebus fire focused on it. Indeed, as soon as its limbs were torn off by cannonballs, they were instantly regrown. Arrived in front of the gate, too close to the ramparts to be the target of the cannons, the troll began to unleash its full might to make the gate yield. The dwarves would not tolerate the work of their ancestor being desecrated any longer.
Suddenly, and with a speed that only a good dwarf masonry could allow, the gates opened and then instantly closed again, allowing a dwarf slayer to pass through.
The dwarf, with his suicidal oath, would be more than happy to find his fate in fighting such a fearsome monster. Surprised by the audacity and fury of this little red-haired creature, the troll first retreated before pulling himself together. The two opponents then confronted each other on the Great Bridge. At the end of an epic battle, the Slayer managed to kill the troll. The monster, in a final spasm, vomited the entire acid content of his stomach onto the dwarf. The Slayer thus died, his oath fulfilled. Meanwhile, at the east gate, a powerful shaman rained a flood of magic on the dwarf defenses. Having identified the perpetrator of all this trouble, the dwarves decided to react in their good old-fashioned way. After a few careful adjustments, a cannon shot cut the magician to pieces. This threat annihilated, Vitar decided to bring the fight to the goblins. The dwarf lord and much of his throng charged across the bridge. Faced with this unexpected attack, the goblins sent a herd of squig, who threw themselves frenetically at the dwarves, but for all their goodwill, the squigs could not hope to pierce the Grandsons' runic shields and armors. So they were methodically cut down. The dwarves were able to advance across the bridge and reach the other side without suffering too great a loss. There, they were awaited by a dark multitude of hooded night goblins ready to fight. Without further ado, the dwarves charged their hereditary enemy. The last of the fanatics who had not been sacrificed in the assault of the gate were sent by the goblins, killing a few dwarves before dying as the result of too much poisonous mushrooms ingested. It didn't stop the dwarves, whose warriors sank deep into the goblin line in a clash of broken bones and smashed metal. The battle raged for hours, with neither side being able to gain an advantage. The greenskin horde seemed infinite, and for every goblin killed by a dwarf, 4 would take his place. At the center of the battle, Vitar faced a goblin chief, a powerful brute who dominated the melee. After a confrontation in which abnormally fast shots were exchanged, Vitar decapitated his opponent with a mighty blow of his runic axe. It was too much for the goblins who, deprived of their leader, fled the battle chased by the dwarves. As for Vitar, he went with his guard to the hills where Fenric and his prisoners stood. Encouraged by the success of their brothers on the right flank, the miners reopened the great door and charged on the bridge where they faced a regiment of wild orcs. The ensuing melee was brutal, with both sides suffering severe losses. Seeing half of his army on the run and the other half engaged in uncertain battle, Fenric, as a seasoned goblin general, sounded the retreat, abandoning in his haste hills and prisoners in the hands of Vitar and his warriors. At the end of the day, only a troll who hadn't understood the significance of the world retreat remained alone and perplexed in the face of the miners who, after having encircled it, destroyed it bluntly. The battle was over. Later, Fenric's name was added to Karak Hvit's Great Book of Grudges. From then on, the dwarves will never stop chasing the warlord to avenge their brothers who died that day.